Why do organisations need to learn to deal with complexity and uncertainty? It's because we have a perfect storm. Perfect storm, which is a combination of people, places and technology, is creating this VUCA landscape. And many of our organisations are struggling. It's an acronym. VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. It has its origins in the US military. At the end of the Cold War, after the US military had effectively won the war, the Russian superpower Soviet Union fell apart overnight, seemingly overnight. And all of a sudden, the American military realised what had been their greatest asset, which was their size and their power and their strength, was very quickly going to become their greatest weakness due to much smaller adversaries, non-state nations, non-state entities. The rise of Islamic State is a classic example of that. So what used to work in the old world, which was size and strength and power, actually makes them most vulnerable in this new world. They came up with this acronym of VUCA. And if you're a US military officer going through training, you will become very familiar with this concept of VUCA because it is drilled into you that this is the new operating environment for the US military. But if you could isolate one component more than any of the other components which are driving this perfect storm, I think you'd really have to focus on technology as being the main driver of this storm of perfect change. So let's investigate this idea just a little bit further. Hands up in the room if you can identify who this man is here. And I'll give you a clue, it's not my father. Now that's a bit of a mean question because you're probably unlikely to know him. You may not know him, but you know of the work that he's done. You know of the work that he's done. His name's Gordon Moore. He was one of the 3 co-founders of the Intel computer chip company. In the late 1960s, he made this observation about computing power. Every 18 months, the processing power of a computer chip doubles. So the number of integrated processors that you could fit on a computer chip was doubling, roughly every 18 months or so. So he made that statement, mid-1960s. He revised it in the early 1970s to be every 24 months. And that observation, Moore's law is an observation, not really a law, but that observation has been maintained. It has run true until today. Now, what happens when something doubles in growth every 24 months? It leads to exponential growth, to an exponential growth rate in our computer technology. What is the problem with exponential growth? Well, us as humans struggle to really understand it. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what exponential growth might look like. One of the great proponents and understanders of exponential growth is Ray Kurzweil, the founder of the Singularity University, and he gives this example. If I were to take 30 steps in a linear function, we all understand linear growth, that might get me just to the other side of the room and out the door. 30 steps in a linear function. If I were to take 30 steps in an exponential function, that would get me around the globe 25 times, or it would take me to the moon and back. That is exponential growth. Another example of exponential growth. The computing power that NASA had when they allegedly put man on the moon is the same amount that I have here in my pocket. An iPhone 6. This is an outdated model. It's not even the iPhone 6S, it's the iPhone 6. In this phone alone, I have as much computing power available to me as all of NASA had in 1969. That is what Moore's law looks like. The problem with exponential growth for us as humans is that in the early stages of it, we don't see any evidence of it happening. And it's only in the later stages of it, when we have what is known as the knee or the kick in the curve, when it really starts going upwards, that you see evidence of that change. The question that we need to ask ourselves today, where do we stand in terms of technology? One other problem I'll point out with exponential growth is, and it's even in the examples that I give you today, there's a problem. Because every example I give you, there's an end point. Whether it's going around the world 25 times, whether it's going to the moon and back, whether it's filling up Hong Kong harbour, there's always an end point. And then you think, oh, okay, that's the end of that analogy, that's the end of that process. That doesn't happen with exponential growth. It just gets faster, and then faster, and then faster. This problem with exponential growth is causing problems for our organisations. And it's also, I think, causing problems for us individually, because we are struggling to keep up with this rapid rate of change. We understand linear growth as humans, relative stable growth. We understand it. Organisations are not structured for rapid change, for exponential growth. Why is this the case? Essentially, it's because our organisational structures that we use today are outdated. They have their origins in the North American railroad boom of the 1850s. The current incarnation of the organisational structure is more than 150 years old, and it hasn't changed significantly since the 1850s. With this discomfort, the difference between linear growth and exponential growth, we see there has been considerable risk. But if we can reframe that and identify the opportunity that lies in this exponential growth. What can I offer from a mountaineering perspective? Well, it just so happens there's a scary coincidence here. The way that a lot of mountaineering is done is also done using traditional linear hierarchies. And you can see on this picture here, it can be an effective way to climb mountains using lots of manpower, using fixed infrastructure on a mountain to overwhelm it. But you can see it's not aesthetically the most pleasing style to climb the mountain in. And when unexpected events happen, such as what has happened on Mount Everest over the past 2 seasons, where there have been multiple fatalities, the traditional linear system tends to fall apart. So in mountaineering, we refer to this as expedition style. What does expedition style look like in an organisation? Because I believe most of our organisations today are structured expedition style. Hierarchical, reliant upon infrastructure, generally ownership of infrastructure and assets. Generally slow to respond to change. Averse to risk, a preference to control the external environment to meet their internal expectations. Generally driven by metrics and quantity, and with a preference for the status quo. A preference for the status quo because that is the world in which they succeeded in. That is the world in which they built their reputations in. And therefore, many organisations are very much protective of the status quo. But that status quo today, via this perfect storm of VUCA, is now seriously at risk. So the idea being that any organisation which is currently expedition style structured, I think needs to seriously consider their position in this world and be open to embracing a new, different way of doing things. What is the opposite of expedition style? It's called alpine style. And to describe that, I'm going to have to take you, well, I should point out it's commonly known as light and fast. Alpine style, light and fast, same thing. To describe this basic concept, we're going to have to quickly visit Switzerland to a particular mountain called the Eiger, nearly 4,000 metres high. I'm sure you've heard of the Eiger, and in particular the north face of the Eiger. It was the last classic unclimbed north face in the European Alps. And during the mid-1930s, the world's attention was focused on who would be the first team to climb the north face. It's an incredibly dangerous face. It's killed more than 64 people. The first team to climb it successfully, a combination of 2 Germans and 2 Austrians did so at last in 1938. It took them 4 days, 96 hours to climb the North Face. Many people tried to climb the North Face subsequent to that. Some were successful, others not so much. But an ascent of the North Face was no longer considered to be absolutely groundbreaking until the year 2008, when this guy came along. And he completely upset the world of mountaineering. How long did it take Uli Steck to climb the North Face of the Eiger? It took the first party 96 hours. Uli took 2 hours and 47 minutes. He cut it down from 96 hours to 2 hours and 47 minutes. Uli climbed alpine style. Uli climbed light and fast. He flipped convention on the head. Most people climb the North Face in the summer months. Uli climbed it in the winter months. Most people climbed it in great teams. Uli moved incredibly quickly, climbing it by himself. Uli dropped 10 kilograms of his own body weight to increase his power to weight ratio, specifically for this climb. The poster child of an organisation which is innovative, agile, light and fast is Uber. They don't own any infrastructure. They're not afraid to upset people. The Alpine style organisation is not hierarchically structured, it is network structured. It is self-reliant as opposed to reliant upon infrastructure. It is fast to respond to change. It is embracing of risk. It relinquishes the need for external control. It is driven by quality as opposed to quantity. And it prefers VUCA, indeed, it succeeds in VUCA. The Alpine style organisation, I think, is the future of organisations. I think the future belongs to the alpinist. That is my truth. The future belongs to the alpinist.